Thank you, Sumia. I know you're probably all looking forward to a 40 winks, but hopefully what I'm going to say now will shock you awake, and you won't need to take those 40 winks. So anyway, so what I will be presenting today is based on a research project I'm conducting with 3 others at the Advocata Institute. Nakia, who will be actually moderating this session, Tashikla Mendis is also somewhere around, and Janani Vanigaratna, where we are trying to analyze the Sri Lanka's tax system. So this is basically some of the findings from that research project. So taxes basically, taxes are the primary source of revenue for the government, and basically they're vital for more sustainable, and I think we've heard that over and over again in the last few sessions, vital for more sustainable and inclusive growth. And basically, why do governments need revenue? We need to ramp up our investment in education, health, to improve productivity. And I think the president basically mentioned that we need to have better education system. We need to enhance infrastructure. And I think in the last session, we were very much confronted with the thought that we really need to have we need more taxes in order to address poverty issues, inequality issues, and to support vulnerable groups in society. And I think that came out very clearly during the COVID pandemic shock, where that was not an option for Sri Lanka. But taxation is, again, not only a means for financing for the government, it also underpins, as Stephen Kidd said a few minutes ago, actually, the contract between the state and its citizens. And that's another reason, because it holds, when we pay our taxes, we basically hold our governments accountable. And when we don't feel that we are paying our taxes, or when it doesn't really cause a dent in our pockets, we kind of lose that contract between the state and society. But what has been the experience of Sri Lanka in terms of raising revenue? So over a long period of time, the government revenue has not been even sufficient to cover even our recurrent expenditure. In 2021, we had government revenue of around 8%, but our recurrent expenditure was double that. So how did we finance that gap? Basically, through borrowings. So if you're borrowing even to spend on our recurrent expenditure, then how do we finance our capital expenditure? Basically, we borrow again, right? So this resource, since our resource collection is inadequate to meet the needs of the country, basically we've had to be borrowing consistently, which has led us to this unsustainable debt level that we now are faced with. So that is one of the main reasons that we need to look at this, and that's why we are talking about this today. And if you look at sort of spending in relation to even other low developing countries, other emerging market economies, and even advanced economies, you'll find that our expenditure on education and health and even social protection is much lower than many of these other countries. And as we said, I mean, those are areas that really need to be ramped up. So while dealing with this prioritization of expenditure, because as somebody mentioned earlier, we spend more on defense than even in some of these other areas vital for improving productivity and growth. But while improving our spending and our expenditure mobilization, spending patterns, we really need to look at the revenue side. So the problem with this revenue collection has basically got worse over time. The tax to GDP ratio, which was on average about 17% in the 1990s, declined in the 2000s to about 14%. And in the last decade, it was averaged about 11%. And this is in contrast to our per capita GDP, which has basically increased threefold, from US dollars 1,300 on average in the 2000s to about 3,600 on average in the last decade. And there are multiple reasons for this declining tax revenue collection. One is our tax policy. We have had very ad hoc changes to tax rates, tax thresholds, a plethora of tax exemptions that has basically narrowed our tax base. But the second issue is also our tax administration. We have multiple revenue agencies, very complicated tax systems with multiple taxes, inadequate use of technology, and basically even a proper monitoring system. And now there are many modern monitoring systems that can be used to basically address the evasion of taxation. And if you look at it across the world as well, Sri Lanka has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. From this selected list of countries, you'll find that Sri Lanka, the only two countries that are below Sri Lanka are really Bangladesh and Ethiopia. So this again underscores the need to really ramp up our tax revenue collection. So although taxation is a contentious issue, it is widely accepted that a certain level of taxation is required for the government to facilitate sustainable economic growth and basically to provide the essential services to its population to ensure greater inclusion. And the empirical evidence basically points to a positive relationship between tax collection and GDP growth. And from this graph, you can see, advanced economies collect higher levels of taxation compared to developing countries. And there's a study that has been done where basically once the tax to GDP level of a country reaches a certain percentage, so it's about 13%, the real GDP of the country rises sharply. And this is sustained over several years. Hence, what the recommendation is that for countries that have low tax to GDP ratios, they are recommended to aim for at least 15% tax to GDP ratio for at least 15%, so that they can move to a higher growth trajectory. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka, basically you can see that we are far behind this level, which means that we have to significantly ramp up our tax effort. Right? So what we mean by tax effort is actually the amount we collect versus our potential. And this increase in tax collection needs to be achieved, of course, without compromising growth, through some well-designed policies to broaden our tax base and basically improve compliance and administration. So one argument that we have heard quite often for a low tax regime is that it will stimulate economic growth, leading to higher revenue collection in the future. However, this depends fundamentally on the elasticity and buoyancy of a tax system. So in our research, we basically did some estimation on the elasticity and buoyancy of the tax system in Sri Lanka. And what I mean by elasticity is basically it's how tax revenue responds to changes in income or economic growth. And if the elasticity is greater than 1, it means that the tax revenue collection, it's elastic, the tax system is elastic, and its response to economic growth is higher. So as economic growth increases, the proportional increase in revenue collection is higher. However, vice versa, if it's less than 1, the tax revenue actually decreases, and there's a threat to fiscal sustainability unless there's some adjustment in spending. So in Sri Lanka, what you've seen is that the tax to elasticity, so we basically calculated it for 3 different periods. You'll see that the tax elasticity has actually declined over time and consistently been below 1, which means that the tax revenue is less responsive to changes in economic growth. And the tax buoyancy, which is the graph on the right, is basically a similar concept. But here we look at discretionary changes. We include the discretionary changes in taxation. That is taxation collected due to ad hoc changes in taxes or the introduction of new taxes. And what we find there is, okay, it's actually, it's still less than 1, but higher than elasticity, which means that we have been relying more on these ad hoc policy changes to collect taxes, to raise revenue, rather than improving our tax system and our administration. So understanding this is very crucial because it shows that despite the increases in GDP and GDP per capita, the relatively low elasticity and buoyancy of the tax system has led to this decline in government revenue, further sort of reinforcing the need for comprehensive tax reforms. So where is the scope for Sri Lanka to mobilize more taxes? So we looked at three main areas where tax effort can be increased. One is in relation to the taxes we consume, so the largest tax, which is the VAT, in relation to what we earn, so income taxes, and we also did something on property taxes, what we own, which I will discuss a little more in detail. So when we look at the VAT, you'll find that this is one of the major sources of revenue around the world, and since its introduction in 1960, there are about 160 countries that have actually, there are very few countries really, or major countries, that have not adopted the VAT. Sri Lanka implemented it in 2002. Sort of it took over what was called the GST, which was implemented in 1998. But what we see is that the VAT to GDP ratio has actually consistently fallen. So we had a VAT to GDP ratio of about 6% in 2004, but it has subsequently declined to 2% in 2021. So this is one of the reasons, or some of the reasons are these frequent changes in VAT rates, revisions to the tax threshold, a plethora of tax exemptions, which have significantly eroded the tax base and hence revenue collection. In addition, of course, there have been administration issues that have contributed to this low tax collection, particularly the lack of use of certain technology to basically assess and to monitor tax VAT receipts. So to assess the performance of VAT, we calculated this metric called the C efficiency ratio, which is a widely used indicator to assess the performance of VAT. And it gauges basically the extent to which VAT has been applied uniformly across the tax base. So even compared to other Asian countries, you can see that the C efficiency ratio in Sri Lanka is one of the lowest, indicating that we have not maximized the revenue collection from this source. And the other, if you look at the graph on the right side, you can see that the C efficiency ratios actually declined over time. So it was 25% in 2010, but now 10 years later, in 2020, it was down to 17%. And in most high-income countries, the C efficiency ratios are usually about 50%. And even in this graph, you can see Japan and Thailand have values of over 50%. So what this implies is the low ratio indicates the level of erosion of the tax base, either a result of number of exemptions, high thresholds, exempting, which means that a large proportion of the economy is exempt from VAT, and which is referred to as a policy gap, or due to enforcement and collection issues, which we refer to as a compliance gap. So much of the literature shows that in the other countries, this policy gap has been the main really reason why this C efficiency ratio has been low. But when we did the analysis and when we disaggregated the C efficiency ratio into the compliance gap and the policy gap, we found that both were significantly had affected the low C efficiency ratio in Sri Lanka, which means that it indicates that we need to improve our policy making in terms of the VAT, but also that the tax collection authorities also have an equally important role to play to improve tax revenue collection. That means like both factors really need to be addressed. So these are again some numbers for you to understand where we stand. Sri Lanka has one of the highest thresholds of VAT in Asia. This was when we had a threshold of 300. Now I think they're subsequently bringing it down, but still it is still significantly higher than most countries in Asia. And when we increased it to 300 million, we lost something like 70% of the registered VAT players were just wiped out of the system. So now actually they've decided they're going to reduce it to 120 million. But the question is, how did they come up with that 120 million? What was the scientific basis? Will that earn the kind of revenue that we need from VAT? So the question is, we sort of arbitrarily come up with these values, but we really need to have some kind of scientific basics in determining things like the threshold. The other one is the VAT rate in Sri Lanka is also one of the lowest in the history of VAT. So the 8% VAT I'm talking about is the lowest in the history of Sri Lanka, as well as one of the lowest in the region. And another problem is this, as I said, these ad hoc changes in VAT. We have changed, the VAT rate has been revised 6 times since its adoption in 2002, which leads to great uncertainty and difficulties in administration. Now, there are the norm is basically, or the ideal situation is basically that you do not change or you do not tinker with the VAT system once it is implemented. And most countries that have been successful have basically stuck to that. So us, the continuous tinkering with the VAT system has been a huge problem in our VAT collection. And you can see that, but you can see that the rate is not the only issue. Here we calculate something called the effective tax rate. And if you look at the difference between, the standard tax rate is the tax rate that is applied, but the effective rate is actually what you're actually earning based on that. You see that there's a huge gap between the two. And the gap basically shows the number of exemptions, the amount of the economy which is basically outside the tax system. And basically, it highlights a scope to increase revenue collection by expanding the tax base and reducing exemptions, but also improving the tax administration. So that's to do with the consumption taxes. Moving on to income taxes. So we have basically our direct taxes, consumption taxes have been the mainstay or have contributed the most actually to tax revenue. So we've always talked about this, the ratio of direct to indirect taxes have been something like 20 to 80%. The intention has always been to reverse that and to have at least 60 direct and 40 indirect. But we've never been able to really move towards a more progressive system. But I think that is something that we really need to address. Because if you look at the distribution of income in Sri Lanka, you'll find that 20% of households enjoy 50% of the income generated in the economy. So really, the burden of taxation or the higher taxation must be borne by higher income earners. And I think in this crisis, we really need to focus on that because in the previous sessions, we've heard how this crisis is affecting the most vulnerable groups in society. And when you say vulnerable, it's actually not even the first, second, third decile. I think some people are talking about the fifth and sixth deciles also being, at very vulnerable levels. So we really need to move towards this more progressive tax system. But if you look at the right side, you can see what has happened in reality. In reality, what has happened is as per capita income has increased, personal income taxes as a percentage of GDP has actually declined. And there are many reasons for that. Again, if you look at the thresholds, we have very high thresholds. I'm again looking at the threshold that was introduced in 2019 of 3 million, a tax-free threshold of 3 million. Basically, that was 4 times up per capita GDP at that time. Now we are reducing it to 1.2 million, but even then it's about twice up per capita GDP. However, in advanced economies, the threshold is roughly about 0.25%. So we are still much, 4 times more than that. And it is there's evidence that developing countries that have a threshold of over 1%, or 1 times the per capita GDP, have generally failed to raise sufficient revenue and found themselves in very difficult fiscal situation. And here again, you can see why. We have one of the lowest personal tax income rates in much of this region, which has led to this low tax to GDP collection. Moving on to corporate taxes, basically what we see there is, again, this whole thing of exemptions. corporate income taxes, we have depended on a very few sectors of the economy. So we basically took the 250 companies listed in the stock exchange, and we looked at their tax payments. So, and they account for about 25% of total corporate taxes. The interesting thing we found from that was that the tax was borne by very few sectors. Primarily, the financial services bore a very high burden of taxation. And you had the food and beverages sectors and telecommunications. Everything else was much smaller, so we just lumped them as other sectors. But basically, these were the sectors that really bore a larger proportion of the taxes. And of course, SOEs are also another contributor to taxes. So many sectors of the economy, because they are exempt, are subject to lower tax rates. So, for example, IT, agro-processing, exports, pay very little taxes compared to their contribution to GDP. So if you look at the right, I have showed you the contribution to GDP from different sectors, particularly if you can see construction, real estate, transportation, warehousing activities. Although the contribution to GDP is much higher, they don't really feature very much in terms of tax revenue collection. So this differentiation or differential tax treatments for different sectors basically ends up distorting the allocation of resources. And we've seen that, right? So you basically can see why certain sectors have grown significantly in the economy, because they have had much better treatment in terms of taxes. And also, when you look at the financial sector, we can see the inordinate burden that the financial sector is bearing, which may be something that we need to think about, particularly given what's going on right now in the financial sector and in the economy, because they are bearing a sort of undue burden or a disproportionate burden of taxation. So I'm going to stop here, and I think we'll carry on the conversation during the discussion. Thank you.